The snow had been falling since 4 in the afternoon. By 7, it had buried the sidewalks of Midtown Manhattan under a smooth, indifferent white. Taxis crawled with their yellow lights blurred soft by the accumulation on their roofs. The Aurora Grande's brass revolving doors turned and turned, admitting guests in coats that shed snow onto the marble lobby floor. The doormen, in their dark green livery, kept their faces professionally neutral through the cold. Outside, winter and silence, and the muted city. Inside, gold light and strings, and the particular animal warmth of 700 people arranged in their finest clothes. The annual Carter Foundation Charity Gala was, by any standard, a significant event. The foundation's work funding pediatric medical research, supporting arts programs in underfunded schools, providing emergency relief infrastructure, made it the kind of cause that attracted both genuine philanthropists and people who required to be seen attending genuine philanthropy. The ballroom reflected this mixture, tables of people who meant what their donations said, seated alongside tables of people who had spent more on tonight's outfit than the scholarship fund they were celebrating. Ethan Brooks could tell the difference. 3 years of working rooms like this one had calibrated him finely. He knew the way the chandeliers caught the crystal stemware at exactly the right angle, throwing tiny prisms across the white tablecloths like confetti that never moved. He knew how the carpet absorbed sound, so that 700 people talking at once produced a noise more like weather than conversation, a low, relentless pressure that settled behind the sternum. He knew the service entrance on the east side, the way the kitchen door swung left and needed to be caught with your elbow, the unwritten rule that you never crossed in front of a moving guest unless they had already stopped. He knew which tables ordered the champagne quickly, and which ones would call for still water repeatedly and never tip. He knew, with the precision of someone who relies on this knowledge for his income, exactly which parts of this room existed for him to navigate and which parts did not. What he did not know, on this particular night, was where to look. He kept his eyes on the trays. That was the trick. His manager Dennis had told him years ago. In his first week at the Aurora Grande, you keep your eyes on the trays, and the guests keep their eyes on their own conversations. You become part of the room. Invisible. Ethan had learned that lesson well. He had needed to. He was 34 years old. He had been a waiter at the Aurora Grande for 3 years, working the breakfast shift at a diner in Hell's Kitchen from 6 to 11, then catching the uptown subway to be in uniform by noon. 2 jobs, 6 days a week. On Thursdays, the schedules overlapped, and he ran not metaphorically 4 blocks between the diner apron and the hotel jacket, arriving at the staff entrance pink-cheeked and slightly out of breath, which Dennis overlooked because Ethan was reliable in every other respect. The math of this life was tight, but it held. Just barely. Just enough. On the 7th day Sundays, always he took his daughter to the park regardless of the weather, because that was the one thing in the week that was entirely theirs, and he was protecting it like a vault. Lily was 9 years old, and currently in the custody of his colleague Marcus's family for the evening, which was an arrangement that had required 2 weeks of negotiation, because Lily had views about being left with people she barely knew. He had, in the end, secured her agreement by promising that she could draw whatever she wanted for however long she wanted the following morning, with no suggestions from him about what to draw or how to draw it. This was a significant concession. Lily took her drawing seriously. She had left him one anyway. That morning before school, she always left him one of a man in a bow tie carrying a tray, serving a very large bird with a crown. The caption, in her best 3rd-grade printing, read, "Daddy at work. The bird is the boss." He had folded it and put it in his breast pocket. He always did. He was refilling a water glass at table 14 when he first saw her. She was seated in the far corner of the ballroom, at one of the smaller round tables near the east window. The ones that the event planners used for overflow seating, and that guests tended to interpret, consciously or not, as lesser locations. The table had been set for 8. It held only her. She sat in a dress, the color of deep water, not quite blue, not quite gray, the color of the Hudson on an overcast afternoon, and her posture was the kind that looks effortless, only because it costs a great deal. Straight spine, shoulders level, head slightly lifted, the posture of someone who has been told all her life that how she holds herself matters. Her dark hair was pinned simply, with nothing theatrical about it. She was, he would have guessed, 27 or 28. The scar ran from just below her right temple to the midpoint of her jaw. It was not small. It was not the kind that could be mistaken for a shadow in low light or a trick of the chandelier's angle. It was the kind that had been carefully and expensively reduced over a long period and with considerable medical skill to the version he was seeing now, and this version was still significant, still visible, still the thing that made the nearby tables glance and glance again. She was holding a champagne flute with both hands and not drinking from it. Ethan moved on. He was paid to be present without being conspicuous. He was paid to notice nothing and remember everything. He came back past her table twice more in the next hour. Each time, the 7 chairs around her remained empty. The other guests had arranged themselves, in the subtle hydraulic way of social gatherings, to maintain a clear buffer of uninhabited space between themselves and the corner table. Each time he passed, she was looking at the window, not out of it, because the snow pressed flat and dark against the glass, and there was nothing to see but at it, at the surface itself, as though the frost forming at the edges held something worth reading. The man who spoke first was at table 12. Ethan would remember him afterward only as the one in the burgundy pocket square, though he never learned his name and made no particular effort to. He said something low to the woman beside him, and she laughed a brief, complicit laugh, the laugh of someone receiving confirmation of what they already believe, and then they both looked toward the corner table, and the man said it again, slightly louder, clearly comfortable in his assessment. Seriously though, who's going to dance with that? The woman beside him said, Carter's going to have a problem on his hands all night. Her voice had the tone of someone who mistakes frankness for honesty, who believes that saying the cruel thing clearly is somehow less cruel than saying it quietly. She used to be something, apparently, the man said. Before the accident. He shook his head in a way that was meant to suggest sympathy, and landed as something else entirely. Ethan's hand tightened on the neck of the water pitcher. He had been refilling the glass at the adjacent table. He held the pitcher steady with effort, and finished what he was doing without pouring too much, which was, under the circumstances, a small accomplishment. Then he walked to the service alcove near the kitchen entrance, set the pitcher on the shelf with a quietness that required deliberate control, and stood with his back against the cool wall. He thought about his daughter's drawing, the man in the bow tie, the crowned bird, the caption in its careful printing. He thought about something else too, about a Tuesday morning in March, about a coffee maker finishing its cycle alone. Then he thought about the woman in the corner with her hands around a glass she wasn't drinking from, and the empty chairs, and the frost on the window. He straightened up. He smoothed the front of his jacket. He did not think too long about what he was about to do, because he had found, in the past several years, that thinking too long about things was how you talked yourself out of them. His wife's name had been Caroline. She had been 29 when she died, and she had been, there was no other word for it, luminous. Not in any theatrical sense. Luminous the way a lamp is luminous, warm, necessary, making everything near her easier to see. She had laughed at her own jokes before she finished them. She had kept a list on the refrigerator titled Things That Are Actually Fine, and added to it whenever she was anxious. She had loved Lily with an intensity that made the air in their apartment feel different, thicker, more substantial, like love had physical weight. She had died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years ago. She had been making coffee. She was there, and then she was not there, and the coffee finished brewing on its own. Ethan had not left the apartment for 11 days afterward. His sister had come and taken Lily to her place in Queens, and he had sat in the kitchen and looked at the coffee maker for a very long time. He did not know what he was doing. He was not crying. He was not anything. He was a room from which all the furniture had been removed, and he was waiting to find out what would fill it. What filled it, eventually, was practicality. There was rent. There was Lily. There was the particular arithmetic of single parenthood, which does not care about grief and cannot be argued with. He had gone back to work. He had learned to pack lunchboxes at 6 in the morning and help with homework at 9 at night and sleep in the middle section of the bed because he could not yet sleep on his side of it. In his breast pocket, alongside Lily's drawing, he carried Caroline's handkerchief. It was pale blue with white embroidery at the corner, a small set of interlocking C's for Caroline Cole, which had been her name before she became Caroline Brooks. He had carried it for 3 years. He did not use it. He carried it the way some men carry a photograph. Not to look at, but to know it was there. He carried it now, smoothing the front of his uniform jacket in the service alcove, thinking about the woman in the corner. He was not naive. He understood the social architecture of a room like this one, the way status arranged people as surely as the seating chart had. He was wearing a bow tie and carrying a water pitcher. She was the CEO's daughter. There was a gap between those two facts wide enough to fall into, but he had listened to those two people at table 12, and he had felt something settle in him like concrete, setting a kind of cold, quiet certainty. Not anger, not heroism, something simpler. Someone should go over there. He knew what it felt like to sit alone in a room where everyone was paired. He had done it at his wife's cousin's wedding, 8 months after the funeral, at a round table with 7 strangers who did not know what to say to him. He had sat there for 2 hours. Nobody had come. He straightened his jacket. He took the handkerchief out of his breast pocket and put it in his trouser pocket instead, making room. Then he crossed the ballroom floor. She had not wanted to come. She had told her father this 4 separate times over the course of a week. Once in the car on the way back from her physical therapist, when he had first mentioned it. Once at dinner 3 days before the event, when he had raised it again. Once on the phone the morning of, when she had called to say she had a headache, which was true. She frequently had headaches. And once more, in the elevator of the Aurora Grand itself, with the noise of the arriving guests audible through the lobby doors, and her father standing beside her in his best suit, looking at her with that expression she knew so well, the one that held grief and hope in precise equilibrium, the one that was always asking the same question without words. Will tonight be the night you come back? The Carter Foundation had been her mother's project. Margaret Carter had founded it 18 years ago, in response to a news story about pediatric cancer research funding gaps. She had read about it over breakfast, set down her coffee, and said to Richard, "I'm going to do something about this." And then she had done exactly that, with the focused, patient tenacity that had characterized everything she undertook. She had built it over 15 years. She had died of ovarian cancer 6 years ago, and Richard had continued it in her name, because it was the only way he knew to keep her present in the world in any form. This was the reason Isabella came every year. Not because she wanted to, because her mother had built it, and it was a way of holding something of her. Just an hour, her father had said in the elevator, his hand on her shoulder, his voice doing the thing it did when he was asking a great deal and knew it quieter than usual, more careful. For the foundation. "You don't have to stay the whole night." She had nodded. She had said yes. She said yes all 4 times, because the answer was always yes. It just took her longer to arrive there. Her name was Isabella Carter. She was 27, before the accident, and she was exhausted, deeply exhausted. Of the phrase "before the accident," which divided her life as cleanly and irreversibly as a border crossing she had been, by all external measures, someone who moved easily through the world. Not carelessly, she had always been more thoughtful than her social confidence suggested. But easily, she had attended events like this one and talked to strangers and danced and laughed and moved through a room without the sensation that the room was watching her. She had one photograph from 3 years before the accident, a birthday party, her 21st, a rooftop in Brooklyn, in which she was looking at the camera with an expression that she now studied sometimes, trying to locate the specific quality of unself-consciousness in it. She could not replicate it. She could not even entirely remember what it felt like. A car had come through a red light on Lexington Avenue on a Thursday afternoon in late November. She had been crossing on the walk signal, mid-stride, thinking about nothing in particular. She remembered this clearly, the ordinariness of the moment, how completely unguarded she had been. how the whole machinery of the city had been operating normally in every visible respect, and then there was a sound and a force and a whiteness, and the next thing she remembered with clarity was a ceiling, and her father's voice, very close, saying her name in a tone she had never heard from him before. She had spent 11 days in the hospital. She had spent the better part of a year, moving between recovery rooms and consultation offices and physical therapy appointments, in the measured and carefully managed world of people rebuilding a body that has been significantly altered. 17 surgeries total. The damage to her face had been addressed methodically by a surgical team whose skill and care she did not doubt, and whose results, her primary surgeon had told her honestly and with great kindness, represented the best outcome available to her. The scar had been reduced. It had not been removed. It would not be removed. This was, now, her face. And she had needed to decide what to do with that fact. She had decided, eventually, after a period she preferred not to detail even to herself, to accept it, not with joy, not with the performed flourishing that social media wellness culture would have preferred, the triumphant before and after narrative, the "it made me stronger" declaration. She had accepted it the way you accept an immovable fact. By learning to walk around it. By finding the shape of a life in which it was present and not, therefore, impossible. What she had not been able to do, not yet, not reliably, was be in a room like this one. With lights like these. With faces like these. From across the room, through the low-grade roar of 700 guests and a live string section, she heard the man at table 12 as clearly as if he were standing beside her. Not every word. Enough words. She did not turn. She did not look at him. She looked at the frost forming at the lower edge of the window glass, at the way it built outward from the corners in branching patterns that were almost mathematical, and she performed the calculation she had been performing all evening. How many minutes remaining? How many minutes before she could go to her father and say, "I stayed an hour. I'm going home now." How many minutes before she could be in the car? The city sliding past the window, the cold kept out. She was almost at the answer when she became aware that someone was approaching. She felt it before she saw it, a change in the quality of the air near her, a focused presence that was different from the ambient motion of the ballroom. She kept her eyes on the window. She heard a voice say, quietly, "Excuse me." She looked up. He was standing at an appropriate distance, not close enough to be presumptuous, not so far that it seemed like an announcement. He was wearing the hotel uniform, black jacket, white shirt, bow tie. He was perhaps 6 years older than her, with the kind of face that does not photograph well but reads as trustworthy in person. Honest plains, no theater. He was holding nothing. He had set down whatever he'd been carrying. He said, "May I have this dance?" The room did not fall silent all at once. It fell silent in stages. First, the tables nearest the corner, the people who had been watching, who felt the sudden shift in the air the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before you understand what it means. Then the tables beyond them, responding to the silence as silence always spreads. In rings, like something dropped in still water. By the time Isabella processed what she had heard, perhaps 30 people had turned to look. She stared at him. He did not waver. He did not smile in a way that suggested performance. He was simply standing there, with his hands loose at his sides, waiting. "I'm sorry," she said. "I asked if I could have this dance." He paused. "The song started about a minute ago. We've still got time." She became conscious of the orchestra. They were playing something slow, a waltz, or near enough. The kind of melody that seems to exist outside of time. She had not registered it until this moment. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him more carefully. There was something in his expression that she could not immediately name. It was not pity, which she knew the shape of intimately, and it was not attraction performing as charity, which she also knew. It was something steadier, something that reminded her, oddly, of the way her father looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. "Why?" she asked. He considered this for a moment. He said, "Because you're sitting alone at a table set for 8. And the music is good. And I think you've been watching that window long enough." She felt something loosen, very slightly, in the architecture of her chest. "I'm not a very good dancer," she said. "Anymore." "Neither am I," he said. "That's fine." She looked at the dance floor. She looked at the faces turned toward them. She felt the pressure of those faces, all those watching eyes, and she thought, this is the moment. Not the accident, not the surgeries, not the 17 separate conversations with medical professionals about the word permanent. This was the moment. A man she had never met, standing in a ballroom, offering her his hand. And the question was whether she still knew how to take it. She set the champagne flute on the table. She put her hand in his. His name, he told her, as they found their footing on the edge of the floor, was Ethan. "Isabella," she said, "I know. I recognized you from the foundation materials. Your father's photo is at the entrance." She almost laughed. "He'll never stop putting that photo at the entrance. It's a good photo." They were moving now, slowly. More conversation than dance, the kind of dancing that happens in the space between people who are still deciding whether to trust each other. He led without asserting it, which she noticed. His hand was warm and not sweaty, and he did not grip too hard. She was aware, sharply, of being looked at, but there was something strange happening, something she had not expected. The awareness was there, yes, but beneath it, something else was rising. Not confidence exactly. Not its opposite. It was more like the feeling of a room beginning to warm after a long winter. Gradual, imperfect, real. She breathed. She said, almost to herself, "I haven't done this in 3 years. Danced? Been in a room like this?" She paused. "Been in a room like this and stayed." He said nothing immediately. Then, "What made you stay tonight?" "My father. He needed me to." She looked up. "What made you come over?" He took a moment. "I heard what that man said." "At the table near the window." She nodded, once. She had assumed. "I want you to know," he said, "that I'm not here because of that. I'm here because he stopped. Tried again. I know what it feels like to be in a room where everyone is paired, to be the person the room doesn't know what to do with." He looked at her steadily. "You're the bravest person in here." That's what I wanted to say. I didn't know how else to say it. She felt something happen in her face, not the scar, the rest of it, the muscles she had been holding still for 3 years. She smiled. She was not sure when she had last done that in front of a stranger. And this struck her, suddenly, as both sad and funny. And she laughed once, briefly, almost surprised at herself, and Ethan looked at her with an expression that was quiet and warm and entirely unrehearsed. "See," he said, "bravest person in the room." They kept dancing. Richard Carter was 58 years old and had spent the better part of 3 decades building a company from a mid-tier logistics firm into one of the 12 largest private equity operations on the East Coast. He had survived 2 recessions, 1 hostile takeover attempt, 1 divorce, and the death of his wife. He was not, by any external measure, a man who frightened easily. He was frightened now. Not of anything in particular. He was frightened in the way parents are frightened, that diffuse, sourceless fear that is really just love without a clear object. Love that cannot protect what it loves and knows it. He had been watching Isabella from the VIP table since she sat down. He had seen the people at table 12. He had heard, or guessed, what they said. He knew those faces. He had seen them at 40 events, just like this one. And he knew the geometry of exclusion when it organized itself in a room. He had wanted to cross the ballroom and sit with his daughter. But he had stopped himself, because Isabella had told him, firmly, 3 weeks ago, that she did not want to be accompanied. She wanted to try. On her own terms. He had respected that. He was not sure he had done right. And then the waiter had walked across the floor. Richard had watched him set down his pitcher. Had watched him cross the room with a deliberateness that was quiet and unhurried, and had nothing of performance in it. Had watched his daughter look up, had watched the exchange he could not hear, had watched Isabella set down her glass. When she put her hand in the waiter's hand, Richard Carter, who had not cried at his own wife's funeral because he had been holding Isabella's hand, and she had needed him to hold it, felt his eyes fill. He reached for his glass and looked away, toward the window, and composed himself. When he looked back, they were dancing. He watched his daughter smile. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth and breathed through his nose until he was certain he could trust his face. Nobody saw the child come in. This was partly because there were 700 guests and a live orchestra and the particular ambient noise of a major charitable event at full pitch. It was partly because children were not expected at the Aurora Grand Gala, and humans tend not to notice what they are not expecting. It was mostly because Lily Brooks moved very fast when she had made a decision. She was 9 years old, and she had spent the evening with the family of another waiter who had agreed, as a favor to Ethan, to watch her for the night. His family lived on the Upper West Side, 12 minutes by cab. And Lily had taken herself to the lobby. She was not supposed to do this. She would explain later, with great confidence, that she had calculated the risk and found it acceptable, and told the doorman that her father was inside and she had something very important to give him. The doorman had let her through on the strength of her certainty. She found the ballroom. She found, after some maneuvering, a gap in the guest flow that deposited her near the dance floor. She looked for her father. She found him. She looked at the woman he was dancing with. She pushed through 2 guests, both of whom parted for her in sheer surprise, and arrived at the edge of the dance floor, holding a folded piece of paper and out of breath. "Daddy," she said. Ethan stopped. He looked down. His face did a rapid sequence of things: recognition, relief, confusion, exasperation, and then settled into a kind of exhausted love. "Lily, how?" "I walked," she said, which was not the question he had asked. Isabella was looking at the child with an expression Ethan could not quite read. Lily, for her part, was looking at Isabella, with her head tilted slightly to the left, the way she always looked at things she was trying to understand. "Hi," Lily said. "Hi," Isabella said. "You're very pretty." This was Lily's standard opening with adults she found interesting. She used it without strategy. She said it because she meant it. The way she said everything. Isabella went very still. She looked at this 9-year-old with the serious eyes, and the folded paper, and the absolute freedom from self-consciousness that only children possess, and she felt something give way in her chest, not painfully, gently, like ice coming off a roof in early spring, and her eyes filled. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was careful. "I drew a picture," Lily said, holding it out to Ethan, "of you dancing. But I didn't know who you were dancing with, so I drew a princess." Ethan unfolded it. He looked at it for a moment. A man in a bow tie. A figure in a blue dress with an indeterminate crown, and he pressed it against his chest for a second, before folding it again. "It's me," Isabella said. She was still looking at Lily. "I'm the princess." She paused, and her voice shifted slightly. Became careful in the way voices become careful when they are trying not to break. "What's your name?" "Lily." "Lily." She knelt, there in the middle of the ballroom floor, in her deep-water dress, on the fine carpet. "Hi. I'm Isabella. Are you sad?" Lily said. "I was. I'm not so much anymore. Daddy says sometimes you just need someone to come sit with you." Isabella looked up at Ethan. He met her eyes. He was, she realized, a man who meant what he said, and said what he meant, a quality so rare in a room like this one, that it had the force of something extraordinary. "Your dad is right," Isabella said. She opened her arms, and Lily, with the total and unjustified confidence that children extend to people they have correctly identified as safe, walked into them. And Richard Carter, watching from the VIP table, felt the thing he had been holding since the evening began finally dissolve. He pressed his hand over his eyes. He was not embarrassed. He was a father watching his daughter be held by a child who had decided she was worth holding, and that was all it took. In the end, not a speech, not a grand gesture, just a little girl's arms, and the simple, certain declaration, "You're pretty." He wept, without sound. Nobody noticed. The orchestra played on. It happened in the way that the most important things happen, accidentally, in a moment that was not constructed for it. Lily had climbed into Isabella's lap. This was where she ended up after the hug. As naturally as water, finding a lower place, and Ethan was standing beside them both, and the orchestra had shifted from the waltz to something slower, something that seemed almost designed for the interval between events. Ethan reached into his pocket for something. He was not sure what the habit of reaching. A nervous hand. What came out was Caroline's handkerchief. It fell. He caught it, but not before it had been seen. Richard Carter was there. He had crossed the room without Ethan noticing. He had come quietly, drawn by the image of his daughter kneeling on the dance floor, by the child in her lap, by the scene that had reorganized the entire ballroom's social gravity, without anyone deciding it should. He had come just to stand near them. He had not intended to speak yet, but he saw the handkerchief. He saw the pale blue, the white embroidery, the interlocking letters at the corner. He went pale in a way that was not metaphorical. The color left his face as though a tap had been turned. "Where did you get that?" he said. His voice had changed register completely. Ethan looked up, startled by the tone. "It was my wife's," Ethan said, carefully. "She passed 3 years ago. I carry it." He stopped, reading something in Richard's face that he could not yet name. "Is something wrong?" Richard reached out and touched the edge of the handkerchief, not taking it, only touching. "The way you touch something you are not sure is real." "Those initials," he said. C. Caroline Cole," Ethan said. "That was her name before we married." Richard looked at him. The ballroom continued around them, oblivious, enormous, full of music and conversation, and the clink of stemware, and in the middle of it these two men faced each other across something that neither had seen coming. "My brother's name was Charles Carter," Richard said. "He went by Charlie. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He died 8 years ago." He paused. He had not spoken his brother's name in a social setting in years. It still cost something. He was in the habit of giving things away. Anything he valued. He thought Richard stopped again. He said he'd rather the people he cared about have his things while he was alive to know they had them. Ethan was very still. "He gave that handkerchief," Richard said, "to someone he saved. Another soldier. He wrote me about it. A young private who'd been caught in a collapse. The other man pulled him out. He said he wanted the man to have something, but he didn't know what, and he gave him the first thing out of his pocket." The two men looked at each other. "I was 22, Ethan said slowly. "I was deployed to Kandahar. There was a building." He stopped. He was seeing it now. The way you see certain things when their context suddenly shifts. When they emerge from the general deposit of memory into sharp particularity. There was a man. I never got his name properly. I had the handkerchief afterward. I looked for his family when I came home. I didn't know where to begin. Richard Carter's throat worked. "You've been carrying it for 8 years, he said. "Waiting to find them," Ethan said. "Yes." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something extremely large, being understood all at once, the way a room sounds just after a door has been opened onto an unexpected view. Isabella was watching from the floor, Lily still in her lap. She was looking at her father with an expression that Ethan would later try to describe to Lily. Like someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time, and had finally, without deciding to, exhaled. Richard reached out and put his hand on Ethan's shoulder. He gripped it once, firmly, the way soldiers do, or the way men who have lost soldiers do, carrying the gesture forward on behalf of someone else. "Thank you," he said. "For taking care of it." Ethan nodded. He did not trust his voice. "Charlie would have liked you," Richard said. He looked from Ethan to his daughter on the floor. "He would have done exactly what you did tonight." There were apologies, and there were apologies. What Richard Carter delivered was neither. He requested the microphone from the evening's host at approximately 9:45, with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. He was given it without question. This was his foundation, his event, his room, and he stood at the front of the ballroom, holding it with both hands, not performing hesitation but actually taking a moment to look at the room before he spoke. He was, in that pause, looking for something. Afterward, Isabella thought he had been looking for the faces he recognized. He found a few. The man in the burgundy pocket square was near the back. Richard looked at him for 3 full seconds, then looked away. He said, "Some of you were unkind tonight to my daughter." The ballroom went silent with a thoroughness that made the ventilation system audible. 700 people holding themselves very still, each doing a rapid private accounting of where they had been and what they had said, and whether the verb was about to include them. "Isabella has spent 3 years doing something I don't think most people in this room could do," he said. His voice was level and unhurried, and had none of the cadences of a prepared speech. It was the voice of a man saying something he had been thinking about for a long time. She rebuilt herself. Not for an audience. Not because someone told her it was inspiring. She did it in private, in small apartments, in physical therapy offices, on Tuesday mornings, when there was no particular reason to get out of bed, and she got out anyway. She came here tonight at my request. And I want to be clear about what that cost her. Because I know, and you don't. He paused. It cost her everything she had available to spend. She spent it on tonight because I asked her to, and because she loved her mother, and this was her mother's work. And some of you people I've welcomed here, people I've fed, and whose names I know, and whose charitable commitments I've received, used her presence here tonight as material for comments. The silence in the room had a texture now. It was not the silence of an audience being addressed. It was the silence of people who have been correctly identified. "I want to say something about the Carter Foundation," he said. "My wife Margaret founded it on a principle that I'll quote exactly, because she wrote it down and I have it memorized. The value of a human life is not determined by any factor that can be seen from across a room. We've raised $47 million under that principle. We've funded research that has extended the lives of children in 11 states. You've signed your names to that work. Some of you have signed your names to that work and then looked across this room tonight and contradicted it with your mouths." He let that sit. "I'm not issuing an apology on anyone's behalf. I'm stating a fact. There are people in this room tonight who are not welcome at future Carter Foundation events. Not out of anger, and not out of revenge. Out of simple consistency. You cannot believe in the work and behave as you did tonight. I don't know how to explain that more plainly." He handed the microphone back to the host. Then he walked across the dance floor, the same dance floor where, an hour before, a man in a bow tie had asked his daughter to dance, and he went to his daughter and he put his arms around her. She was standing near the east windows with Ethan and Lily. And she let him. And she pressed her face against his shoulder, the way she had when she was small. She said quietly, into his jacket, "You didn't have to. I know." He said, "People will say you made a scene." "They will," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you." He held her more tightly. The applause that followed was not unanimous, and Richard Carter did not appear to be waiting for it. He was holding his daughter, and that was what he was doing, and the room could make of that whatever it needed to. But the applause built from the tables nearest the window, where people had watched the dancing, where people had watched a child climb into a stranger's lap and deliver a verdict that the room's adults had lacked the courage to offer, and it became genuine and sustained. And several guests who had been quiet all evening found that they were standing. The man in the burgundy pocket square had already gone. The gala did not end so much as decompress. In the hour following Richard's speech, then the people who lingered because the evening had turned into something more interesting than they had expected, and they were reluctant to leave it. What remained by 10:30 was a smaller, quieter gathering. People at the bar. People at a few of the round tables near the center, the orchestra playing something unhurried and without particular destination. The catering staff began their measured erasure of the evening, clearing glasses, folding linens, restoring the room to its anonymous pre-event condition. Ethan had been told, by Dennis, that he could finish when the guest count dropped below 50. Dennis had given him this as a practical instruction. Ethan received it as a small gift. He collected glasses, moved trays, spoke to no one. He was, he found, tired in a way that sat in his chest rather than his legs, a specific kind of tired that comes from feeling a great deal in a short period and having no particular outlet for it. Lily was asleep in the side chair where he'd settled her, covered with his jacket, one shoe restored to its correct position on her foot. She slept the way children sleep when they have had an eventful day, completely, without reservation, as though consciousness itself were something you could set aside and retrieve intact. He was watching her when Isabella came to find him. She had changed out of her heels, he noticed. She was carrying them by the straps in one hand, her coat over her other arm. She looked, in the absence of the event's formal pressure, like someone who had just finished running a long and difficult race, not defeated, something past defeat, into the quieter territory on the other side. "Your father," Ethan said, when she reached him. "What he said, I know," she said. "He'll probably spend tomorrow managing calls about it. Will he mind?" She considered this. "No. He doesn't do things he minds doing. He's very clear about that." She looked at Lily. "She's still here. She's extremely good at being places she wasn't invited," Ethan said. "It's going to be either a problem or a career skill, depending." Isabella smiled the same small, uncalculated smile, the one that arrived as if surprised by itself. "How old was she when her mother died?" 6, Ethan said. "She doesn't have many clear memories. Some, the good ones, stayed." "That's good," Isabella said. "That the good ones stayed. I work at it," he said, telling her things, making sure she knows who her mother was. He paused. "I don't want her to only have the absence. I want her to have the person." Isabella looked at him. She had been thinking, for the past hour, about what her father had said. The value of a human life is not determined by any factor that can be seen from across a room, and about the man standing in front of her, and about whether those two things connected to something she could actually act on. Or whether the evening would end, and the city would resume its normal size, and she would go back to the apartment that was fine, that was genuinely fine, that was nevertheless very quiet. She thought about the frost on the window. She thought about the door closing from the other side. She thought, no, the offer came at 11, when most of the guests had thinned to a smaller, quieter group. Richard pulled Ethan aside near the bar, without ceremony, and said, "I'd like to offer you a position, head of operations for the Foundation's event and hospitality division. It's a real job. Good salary, benefits, hours that would let you spend time with your daughter. I'm not doing it as charity. I'm doing it because you're clearly better than the job you're in." Ethan listened to all of it. Then he said, "Thank you. I mean that. But I'm going to say no." Richard looked at him. "I don't say no because I don't need the money," Ethan said. "I do. I say no because," he thought for a moment, "when Lily is older, I want her to know that the job I have was the job I chose, not the job someone gave me because her father was good at a party." "Does that make sense?" "It does," Richard said. "If something opens up that I can actually earn," Ethan said. "Then you'll apply," Richard said, "and I'll make sure your file gets read." They shook hands. It was the handshake of men who have decided to respect each other and have not yet worked out what that will look like. Isabella found Ethan near the east window at 11:15. Lily was asleep in one of the side chairs, small and disheveled, one shoe half off. Her drawing still folded in Ethan's jacket pocket. The snow outside had slowed. The city was muffled and white and very quiet. "I'm going to leave soon," Isabella said. She had her coat over her arm. "It was a good night," Ethan said. "It wasn't a good night," she said. "But it had good parts." He nodded. That was accurate. She looked at Lily. "She's extraordinary. She is." He looked at his daughter too, with the particular expression that parents wear when they believe they are unobserved. "She's the reason I get anything right." Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then, when I woke up in the hospital after the accident, the first person I saw was my father. He was sitting in the chair beside me. He'd been there all night. I remember thinking, okay, as long as there's that, I can do the rest. Ethan did not say anything. He understood she was not looking for a response. Tonight, she said, I thought about that. When Lily said, she stopped. She lifted her chin slightly, the way people do when they are containing something that would otherwise overflow. I thought, okay, as long as there's still that, I can do the rest. She turned to look at him. Can we meet again? She said. He looked at her. He looked at the question and the courage it had taken to ask it. Here, at the end of a night that had required a great deal of courage from her. One more small act of it. Of course, he said. She put her coat on. She walked toward the exit where her father was waiting. And she paused once in the doorway and looked back. And he raised a hand. And she gave him the small, uncalculated smile that he had first seen on the dance floor, the one that had arrived as a surprise to its owner. Then she went through the door. Ethan carried Lily to the elevator at midnight. She did not wake. She was 9 years old and she had done a great deal today: school, and a playdate at Marcus's, and an unauthorized excursion to a Manhattan hotel ballroom, and a consequential hug with a stranger, and she was entirely finished with consciousness for the night. He balanced her against his shoulder, her head lolling with the complete trust of a sleeping child, her breath warm and steady at his neck. In his trouser pocket, a handkerchief, pale blue, that had traveled further than most people travel in a lifetime. From a cabinet drawer in a New York apartment, to a soldier's pocket in Kandahar, to a field hospital to Ethan's hand, to the inside of his jacket for 3 years and back now, by the most improbable route imaginable, to the family it had come from. He had told Richard Carter, quietly, before leaving, that he wanted Richard to have it. He had said it simply. This should go back to you. Richard had shaken his head with a firmness that was somehow also gentle. Charlie gave it to you. He knew what he was doing when he gave things away. He always did. He had put his hand briefly on Ethan's arm. Keep it. He'd want you to have it. So he kept it. He was not sure what he felt about this. He stood in the elevator with his sleeping daughter and tried to locate the feeling, and found that it was something like completion, not the completion of an ending, but the completion of a circle, the particular satisfaction of something that had been closing, at last. He had been carrying it without knowing where it was going. Now he knew. The knowing changed the weight of it. He would tell Lily about it when she was older. Not everything. She was 9, and the parts involving military service and loss and the specific wreckage of a building in Afghanistan could wait, but the important parts, that her father had been helped once by a man he didn't know, and had carried that man's gift for years, and had found the gift's home in the most unlikely way, because he had set down a water pitcher and walked across a ballroom floor. He wanted her to understand that things connect, that what you do when no one is watching and no one will remember arrives somewhere, eventually. That the circles close in time. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. The doorman held the door. The cold came in immediately, sharp and clean, carrying snow, carrying the smell of the city after long winter precipitation. It was the smell of stopped things. Stopped traffic, stopped noise. Everything paused under the accumulated weight of the white. Rough night? The doorman asked, nodding at Lily with the brief, practiced sympathy of someone who had held this door for every variety of New York ending. Good night, Ethan said. He stepped out. The snow had stopped. He had not noticed when, inside the warmth of the ballroom, but it had stopped sometime in the last hour, and the city had settled into the aftermath, that particular post-snowfall hush, in which New York, briefly and reluctantly, becomes beautiful. The streetlights were doubled, themselves and their reflections in the unbroken white of the pavement. The buildings were quiet. A single cab moved, far down the block, leaving 2 thin parallel tracks. He stood on the sidewalk and breathed. Lily shifted against his shoulder, resettled, sighed. He had not resolved anything tonight, he knew. He still worked 2 jobs. He still calculated rent to the dollar. He still slept in the middle section of the bed and was not yet ready to think about what came after that. His life had not been transformed by a single evening. He was aware of the distance between a ballroom at midnight and Tuesday morning at the diner, where the eggs needed to come out at temperature and the coffee had to be fresh, and the customers needed their orders taken with something resembling cheer. But he had danced. He had walked across a floor in front of 700 people and held out his hand to a woman who needed someone too, and she had taken it, and they had moved through something together. And a child had arrived in a ballroom where she had no business being, and declared a woman beautiful and been held in return. And a father had found his brother's gift in the pocket of a waiter, and the years between them had collapsed into something smaller and survivable. These things had happened. He had been part of them. They did not need to be anything more than what they were, and they were enough. He started walking. 3 blocks south, a cab moved toward him through the white. He raised one arm. Lily adjusted automatically, nesting her face deeper into his shoulder, with a small sound that was either contentment or disagreement with Lily. The two were sometimes indistinguishable. He thought about the question Isabella had asked him, standing at the east window with her coat over her arm and her shoes in her hand, and the night winding down behind her. He thought about the way she had asked it simply, directly, with the specific bravery of someone who has decided that the risk of asking is smaller than the weight of not asking. "Can we meet again?" He had said, "Of course," because of course. Because a woman who had spent 3 years assembling the courage to stand in a room and then spent it all in a single evening deserved at least one simple, uncomplicated yes. He did not know what that would become. He was not interested. Tonight, in knowing. Tonight was enough, on its own terms. The cab stopped. He opened the door carefully, arranging Lily against the seat, settling in beside her. She shifted again, found his arm, held it. He looked at her face in the passing streetlight, the serious brow even in sleep, the slight frown of someone working out a problem in a dream. "What are you solving tonight?" he thought. "What's the bird doing now?" The cab moved through the white city. The hotel fell away behind them. He was, he realized, not unhappy. This was not a small thing. He had been many things in the past 3 years. Functional, determined, frightened, exhausted, occasionally proud, occasionally lost. He had not been particularly unhappy. But he had not been not unhappy either. He had been existing in the space between, which is where grief eventually deposits you, if you are diligent and careful and keep getting out of bed. Tonight he was not unhappy. Tonight there was something else, some compound of weariness and completeness, and the specific quiet that follows a day in which something real has happened. He could not have named it better than that. Something real had happened. And he was on the right side of it. And tomorrow Lily would wake up and have opinions about the cereal options. And the alarm would go off at 5:45, and the city would resume its ordinary size. That was fine. That was, in fact, exactly fine. He rode home through the sleeping city, with his daughter's hand on his arm, and his wife's handkerchief in his pocket, and the future lying ahead of him like the untracked snow, unmarked, possible,